What do you see?
Why won't you talk to me?
Are you even listening to me? Uncomfortable Conversations, a candid talk about race and racism.
What do you see?
What do you see when you look at a person of color? Let's have an uncomfortable conversation.
Why won't you talk to me?
Are you engaging me or ignoring me? Let's have an uncomfortable conversation. Do you hear me? I'm talking, but do you actually hear me? Let's have an uncomfortable conversation.
What do you see?
Why won't you talk to me?
Are you even listening to me?
WATN Memphis presents Uncomfortable Conversations, a candid talk about race and racism.
Racism is a societal problem. Societies are made up of individuals. If individuals change their behaviors, we can do away with racism in this country.
That was anti-racism activist Jane Elliott. You may remember Jane from her famous Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes project. She was teaching third graders about racism the day after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed right here in Memphis, Tennessee. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Uncomfortable Conversations, a candid talk about race and racism. I'm Katina, Rankin.
And I'm Rudy Williams. The lesson from Jane Elliott's experiment is ringing true today, especially now after the death of George Floyd, the black man in Minneapolis that died after a police officer kept his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So we here at Local 24 News wanted to take action. We started Uncomfortable Conversations, where we dive into deep topics about race, equality, and justice. Well, this evening we're joined by 6 diverse panelists who are prepared to be as candid as they know how to be, and they will. Tonight, we'll take on 3 topics: racism, white fragility, and medical bias in the black community. So you'll meet our guest in just a moment.
Yeah, that's right. So whether you believe you're a racist, been a victim of racism, or don't believe racism exists at all, tonight, we truly hope you listen, learn, talk, and then take action to end social and racial injustice in your community. Now, here's Local 24 News reporter Brittany Moncrief. Brittany spoke with Mid-Southerners about racism and systemic racism. Let's go ahead and take a look.
This was the auction block where enslaved Africans were bought and sold in Memphis. After slavery, the Shelby County Courthouse was built, and directly across that block are the statues of justice and wisdom. No justice, no peace. But the effects of that era still remain, leading Mid-Southerners to speak out against racism.
It's a learned behavior. I don't think anybody's born with racism in their heart.
Racism really, I think, is fear.
A fear many face daily.
My son has been profiled. We bought him a car for graduation. He's been stopped and asked, whose car is this? Not given anything about what you did.
Moving into a predominantly white neighborhood, the moment that we moved in, the neighbor actually put a Confederate flag in the second floor window of their home.
Messages other groups have witnessed too.
In Chicago, it was a lot more of like crossing the street when you see someone of a different race, or like weird looks. Whereas when I was in the South, it was a lot more blatant, like obvious statements.
I think that has become a mindset for some people. Like, I'm entitled to this because of the color of my skin.
A mindset many aim to reshape.
Try to stand above and try to change the mindset of our people, encourage them to see the good.
Which some hope prevails, and in some cases it has.
We are allowed to walk through the front doors of restaurants. We can't use the same bathroom.
But when thinking about systemic racism,
the system generally preferences us. I mean, the science is there to show that white privilege is definitely a thing. Largely, it's just small advantages that add up over the course of your life.
As Martin Luther King was saying, what good does it do us to be able to sit at the same bar with our white Americans, but not be able to afford the same burger? So there are so many underlying cases of privilege that go unnoticed that we can also relate to, as far as job opportunities or being discriminated against for bank loan, redlining.
Leaving the questions.
How do you fight that? How do you fight the people who write it and sign off on it?
And the answers.
I tried not to participate or be involved with things that could look like I agree with that opinion.
We had to put the right people in place to kind of overtake them.
While difficult to change, hope remains.
It's definitely a complicated situation, which is going to result in complicated solutions. We can't back down just because it seems intimidating. If it's going to be a long process, then we need to start now.
Racism and systemic racism are not black and white issues. It affects all people. So we're going to dig deeper and continue to have these uncomfortable conversations. In downtown Memphis, Brittany Moncrief, Local 24 News.
Now, as we mentioned tonight, we have assembled a diverse panel to discuss race and racism, white fragility and privilege, and medical bias against African Americans. And throughout the evening, we want to hear from you. So get ready to text your questions to 901-321-7520. We want you to meet our panelists now for the evening. Eli Morris, senior pastor of Hope Church. He's been working on racial reconciliation since the early 90s with Hope's Urban Plunge and Hope's Justice Tour. Nikki Bracey, a young social justice advocate and millennial. Dr. Kimberly Brown, an emergency physician and member of the Bluff City Medical Society.
Then we also have Ms. Elaine Turner, a civil rights activist that participated in Memphis lunch counter sit-ins and other protests. And Khalid Kamoa, he's a Decatur, Georgia City Commissioner and candidate for mayor there. Khalid calls himself an elected activist.
And we have, as you can see, Miss Jane Elliott, who conducted the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes exercise, who you heard from at the top of our show. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here. Let's go ahead and get right to it. Ms. Elliott, you are a trailblazing educator that brilliantly taught your students that racism exists. This was back in 1968. And unfortunately today, as you know, we are having these same conversations. And you spent your entire life after this experiment fighting racism. So could you please just go ahead and explain to our viewers exactly what racism is? Because some people think if they don't use the N-word, then they're not racist.
Racism is treating people positively or negatively on the basis of the color of their skin and on the basis of your ignorance about skin color. It has no basis in fact. It was invented in the late 1400s and should never have gone past the late 1400s. We've been living with a lie now for over enough time now. It's time to get rid of it. And we could get rid of it. We could teach ourselves out of it. If we could educate our educators and educate our lawmakers and educate our medical people to stop thinking that there's more than one race, we could solve this problem. But we won't solve the problem until we educate, until we engage in self-education and in the education of our children and our children's educators and the people who write the laws in this country.
I want to hear from our other panelists on what they believe racism is. Pastor Eli, could you chime in for us?
I believe that racism is really a bit of a combination of prejudice plus power. I've never come to believe that a black person can be racist toward me. They may be prejudiced toward me, but it's very difficult for a black person to exercise power in our culture, tragically. And so I believe it has to do with prejudice plus power, and power can affect laws, it can affect income, it does so much, and it keeps people, quote, in their place. I might also say, as a pastor, I have always said racism is spitting in the face of God. My scripture tells me that we are created in God's image. And so when we just determine that we are going to live lives of racism, in my heart, in my theology, I'm spitting in the face of God when I go in that direction.
Nikki, could you follow up, please?
I fully agree with Pastor Eli that it's a combination of both prejudice and power. Something to add is that I think that people have to remember that when we're exploring the concept of racism in America, it's that our entire society was built on the backs of Black people for the benefit of white people. And so the systems that we live in and we move through, they were designed for white people. There has never been a time where entire laws and systems have been put in place specifically to disenfranchise white people. But there have, in fact, been many laws and many systems put in place to disenfranchise Black people. Slavery, Jim Crow laws, segregation, voter suppression. And so while we've come a long way from some of those things, they're still lingering in our systems. And Black people are still trying to climb our way out of 400 plus years of intentional systemic disadvantage. So I totally agree. It's a mix of both power and prejudice.
A lot of times people conflate racism and prejudice. Prejudice is individual feelings, like I don't like Black people, or, I don't like gay people. When we're talking about racism, we're talking about a system of institutional forces. And I think this map from the University of Virginia's Digital Scholarship Library really goes a long way to explaining an institutional force. The FHA was created to expand the middle class. It was the greatest middle class expansion in the history of the world. And Black families were systematically denied access to these home loans, and neighborhoods in Black communities were systematically drawn. There were red lines that were drawn around these neighborhoods that said, do not loan to these people. I'm just going to look at the map for Memphis, and you can go all the way down into street level detail of these maps. But if you look at these areas that are described as hazardous, these are still Black neighborhoods or majority African American neighborhoods today. So African Americans were systematically denied access to capital, to build wealth, to own homes, to get loans, to start businesses. That wasn't just a set of feelings. That was a government institutional program that said, we are going to give money to white people and not to Black and brown people. And to date, the neighborhoods where white people got money, those houses are 2 or 3 or 10 times the value of houses in African American neighborhoods in the same city. And that is true in cities across the country.
The power is what is utmost important as far as how racism permeates the entire community. And that is every aspect of community, as been said, as far as health, as far as justice, as far as employment. All of that is a part of the systemic racism. And that's what we have been fighting to obtain all of this time. Equal justice under the law, equal pay, equal health, all of those things. That's what the fight has been about. From early on, ever since African Americans have been in this country. This is what they've been fighting for, to be treated equally. But racism is so ingrained in the American institution, is so systemic that it will take a lot of undoing. And this is why we have the protests. This is why all of this is still going on, because these laws have not changed.
Dr. Brown, we haven't heard from you.
I just want to reiterate what everyone else on the panel said, but more specifically, speaking about the healthcare system, I think there is so much medical racism because Black and brown people, the Native Americans and Africans that were stolen from our native land and brought into America for slavery, have been experimented on for a medical standpoint for the benefit of white people as well. So now that we have come out of slavery and we have fought for our rights and other aspects, we still see a disparity as much as recently, of course, as the Tuskegee experiment, but of course, seeing now what we're going through with COVID-19 and how some countries want to experiment on people in Africa to give them the COVID-19 vaccine to see how it works over there, because everybody's so afraid of what's going on with COVID-19. So this is very much ingrained. As Ms. Turner said, this is American as apple pie. This is really a part of our country. And unfortunately, medical bias and medical racism is really deeply ingrained as well. So we can't forget that we see it even in our medical industry as well.
Some people think if we have Black friends, or my children's godparents are Black, or as Pastor Eli mentioned, I don't see color, I'm not racist. Is that true?
Well, I think part of the answer to this dilemma is relationships. And so I think that part when people come to know one, it's harder to hate somebody you know. I think it's a tremendous cop-out that a lot of people use. Oh yeah, my best friend in middle school was a black guy. My best friend at work is a African American woman. Okay, all right. Well, then how come it doesn't express itself in the way you live, and the way you talk, and the way you vote, and the way you act? That's pretty cheap to me.
Miss Elliott, I'd love your viewpoint on this.
I think what we have to remember is there's no gene for racism. You aren't born a racist. You have to be taught to be a racist. In this last song in South Pacific, the musical, it says you have to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are differently made, of people whose skin's of a different shade. You have to be carefully taught. And that's what we do in this country. We teach racism on a daily basis. We teach it in the schools where we celebrate Columbus Day and where we call kids white and black. Now, I'm not white. You can call me white until hell freezes over. That won't make my skin white. My shirt is white and my skin is not. My hair is white. My skin is not. People, there's no such thing as a white person. However, if you put name people white and black, you have set up a system where nobody is going to succeed in being friendly, because if white stands for good and black stands for evil, the power of words is absolutely astonishing. Words are the most powerful weapon devised by humankind, and we've got to start using some other words. You need to realize that every person on the face of the earth is a shade of brown. There are no white people. Get over it. And that's why white people are really scared right now, because within 30 years, according to the demographics of this country, within 30 years, white people will be a numerical minority in the United States of America. And that's what white folks are afraid of. They're afraid that when people of color get power, they're going to want to treat us the way we have treated them. And I'm just so tired of people not realizing that once you've been on the receiving end of that ugliness, you don't want to put somebody else through that. And I didn't find that out until I did the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise with my third graders. And the kids on the second day, when they should have been angry and gotten on the brown-eyed people who had abused them on the previous day, those blue-eyed kids, instead of being nasty to them, were much less vicious to the browns than the browns had been to them. And on the third day, I said to those kids, 9-year-olds, I said, why didn't you blue-eyed people get even with the browns? You said you were going to. And those kids almost in unison said, because we found out how it feels to be treated that way. And we didn't want to make anybody feel the way we were treated when we were on the bottom. Now, I think that may be the solution to this. What the solution is that we're going and have been expecting black people to be more human in their behavior and wiser and more forgiving and more tolerant than white people are, at the same time that we're accusing them of being less than. You expect them to be more than and accuse them of being less than. We have created a conundrum here that we had better fix, and we had better fix it before the next 30 years is up. Because white people are going to have a really hard time when they have to listen to the words of people of color who have been putting up with this nonsense for 500 and some years in this country. It's time to get over it. There's only one race. We're all members of it. It's the human race. And you need to realize that we all are descendants of the same modern human beings that evolved in sub-Saharan Africa between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. Get over it. And if you don't want to get over it, then you need to do what I do, which doesn't please anybody very much. A lot of things that I do don't please anybody very much. Get a mask like this and see what it says on it. Get over it. People, just get over it. This has gone on long enough. Get over it. It's a lie. Race isn't a myth. It's a lie that we deliberately made up to justify ugly things that we're doing during the Spanish Inquisition. Get over it, people. You've been lied to long enough, and don't lie to your children anymore. What does it do to a little black boy to have the teacher say, they're the black kids, and these are the white kids, and these are the good kids, and these are the bad kids? Because everybody knows that white stands for good and purity, and black stands for evil and savagery. Let's change the vocabulary. We're using 14th century vocabulary to solve 21st century problems, and you cannot do it. If you people are going to go on believing this nonsense, then what you need to do is go back to traveling the way you did in the 14th century, 14th, 15th century. Use the same kind of communication that you did in those centuries, and I'll be looking for smoke signals rising over my house next week so that I can read what you're going to say about me. You want to live like you did in the 14th and 15th century? Try it. I'd love to see you men in knee trousers and powdered wigs. That's what went on in those centuries. Get over it, people. Come into the 21st century. Stop believing the lie and realize that you're all 30th to 50th cousins. Every one of you is my 30th to 50th cousin. And if you don't want me for a cousin, that's your tough luck. That's the way it is.
Do we feel like we're too far gone to get reins of this and to get over it?
I'm afraid that too many people want to get past it and not to get through it.
Explain that to us.
So if there have been generations and decades and centuries of programs in which white Americans have benefited, mathematically, the only way to correct that is to provide some reparations for African Americans who have not only not benefited from those programs, but have been oppressed by their exclusion of those programs. As the brilliant minister Malcolm X said, it's not enough to take the knife out of my back. You have to heal the wound. And many people in America will not acknowledge that the knife is even there. But you have to take the knife all the way out and heal the wound. And I think that is where the conversations really get uncomfortable. If I acknowledge that I have harmed you, if I apologize for it, and this is something we learn in law, like the first thing they tell you when you have lawyers is don't apologize. Because once you apologize, you are admitting that you are culpable for a harm that you may then be forced to repair in some way.
Listen, in many aspects of our lives, we know that race relations is something that we just can't ignore and we can't escape it, period.
That's right. But oftentimes people find it difficult to talk about, as you just heard, or they just won't. In the book, White Fragility, written by Robin DiAngelo, she describes white fragility as a process. Now, the book in part reads that the smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. The mere suggestion that being white often triggers a range of defensive responses. Now, these include emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation.
We have been getting questions and comments coming in about that. And so, Jane, I'd like to hear you speak to what exactly is white privilege, because there have been some comments that have been coming into us that they've been texting, our viewers have, and saying white privilege does not exist.
In the first place, white people don't exist. We have these lovely titles for things like white fragility about people who don't really exist. Let's get rid of the word white first, and then let's go on to white fragility. White fragility, I read the book. I read some more of it today to refresh myself, and then I decided that's the reason I didn't read the rest of it. People, you need to realize whites are just as intelligent as anybody else, and they can see what's happening, and they can see what's good for them, and they're going to do what's good for them instead of what's good for the society or for the community. To put a whole bunch of little brown-skinned boys in cages on the southern border of the United States in order to see to it that those brown-skinned people don't come into this country because they reproduce too rapidly, to go along with that, to let that happen, is that white fragility? Would you call that a macro-aggression or a micro-aggression? I think it's time for us to look at reality, and the reality is white people have the power to change this situation. If they wanted to do it, they could change it tomorrow. We started this thing, and we could end it if we chose to. We deliberately created racism, and we deliberately decided not to stop it because racism is a profit-making venture. You need to realize, if you haven't read Michelle Alexander's book, you need to read that book, because it will tell you that our prison industrial system is part of the reason we have these problems in this country. We have those problems because we can make black males work for 22 cents an hour. We can give their money they make to the victim of their crime. And if those are victimless crimes, as they were during the Clinton years when he started this marvelous 3 strikes and you're out nonsense, there are still a whole lot of those black males still in prison today, working 8 hours a day. Now, if you make a man work for 8, or anybody work for 8 hours a day, you feed them, you clothe them, and you house them, but you keep them in that cage. That's called imprisonment, and that's called, once again, we're right back to slavery. We have not done away with slavery in this country because slavery paid in the 1600s, and it's still paying today.
Jane, listen, we got a viewer comment to come in. This is Renee from Mississippi, and she says, will you please ask Jane what she thinks of the police beatings of African Americans? Does Jane think the beatings are racially motivated?
Of course they're racially motivated, and they're ignorantly motivated, and they're motivated by ignorance. We've got to retrain, re-educate the police force. They learn the same things that you and I did over the years in school, and what you learn from grades K through 12 is the brightness of whiteness and the wrongness of blackness. Now, people, you have to realize that we have had miscegenation laws in many states in this country, and we still do. We would not allow people of different color groups to mate and reproduce. Folks, if we have kept on doing that, we would have very few people in this country. Don't you realize that we're all members of the same race, we're all members of the same species? It's time to get over it. Beating of black people is something that has been allowed in this country since we think we brought them here. But what we have forgotten is they were here and they were Native Americans. We called them Native Americans before we got here. If you haven't read the April 2018 issue of National Geographic magazine, and you haven't seen the map that shows where modern human beings began and how they managed to populate every landmass on the face of the earth over several thousand years. Every person on this panel is a descendant of those first modern human beings. You need to realize that. Now, well, you have to talk about ignorance if you're going to talk about police brutality.
Okay. All right, Nikki, let me have you to weigh in.
It's the absence of fear of police because of your skin color, the absence of being followed around a store because of your skin color. It's that you don't have to deal with certain things that people of color do have to deal with. And so I think it's hard sometimes for white people to immediately see their privilege because it requires you to first understand someone else's experience, right? A white person understanding that he or she lives a much more privileged life than the average Black person would first have to be aware of the realities of what Black people are going through, and understanding that their everyday experiences are significantly different because of the color of their skin.
Even in this conversation, we're having a conversation about, we're laying out all of these institutional forces and all of these facts, but we're having this conversation about how do we make white people comfortable with all of this overwhelming data that we have that racism exists.
Pastor
That
Eli,
is white.
I really want Pastor Eli to weigh in on this because, you know, we hear people say all the time that white people say you have to make us feel comfortable. But I had a preacher to tell me, why should Black people make white people feel comfortable about racism? We didn't create racism, and so it's not up for us to solve the problem. And so what do you say to that, Pastor Eli?
It is not your responsibility to make us feel comfortable around you. I will say this. I'll tell you what white men need to learn to do. They need to learn to submit to the authority of an African American person at some point in their lives, because they do not believe they have to. And once you begin to understand that you can submit to the leadership and authority of someone that you have been ingrained to see as less, it begins to change your perspective. Listen, I was born and raised in this town. I remember Thursday was Colored Day at the zoo. I asked my mother, why did they get a day? We don't get a day. She says, you get every other day, son. And I just thought I could do anything I want to. I went to Overton High School, the Rebels. We had Dixie played. They ran down the aisles for the pep rallies with a Confederate flag. That seemed appropriate to me. I looked around, there were 1,800 students in my school. Not one of them was Black. Not one of them was Black. And I just thought that was fine. I never once even considered the Black teachers that had to sit in that room while they ran in there playing Dixie and Confederate flags. I never even considered them. That is horrible. It's horrible to think back on that now. Our football team would play football with Confederate flags on their helmets. And it's painful for me to recall my history because it's an embarrassment to me. And we've got to be willing to learn. And that's why, and I hope since 1991, we do a deal called Urban Plunge every year. We go in the city, we spend 3 nights. I take 15, 20 adults. We have a racism panel one night, talk about racism very, very clearly. We've taken since '93, every year we go on a thing I call the Justice Tour, and we go to Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham. We spend a long weekend there. We see everything there. We talk about it at night. We debrief. We watch movies on the way down and back about the civil rights movement. We talk about justice through the lens, the biblical lens of the civil rights movement. And until people are willing to expose themselves to that, I don't know. I don't know. I've never, here's another thing. I've got 3 kids. They're all grown now. I never once worried about them getting pulled over by the police and killed. No, it never entered my mind. And all my African-American friends, especially moms who've got sons, African-American sons, they think about it every day. I never had to have the talk with my sons. Never had to. Wouldn't ever enter my mind. And there's something missing there across our country when white folk don't even get that and feel like they're being attacked. Feel like they're being attacked for not being woke.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that, I think that racism and white supremacy is very insulated. And what I mean by that is, oppressed people cannot pull themselves out of their oppression. It requires the oppressors to lift the oppressed people out of their oppression, right? It requires for the dominant race or the dominant group to have a hand in ending whatever the oppression is. And so, it's very insulated because white people first have to have that knowledge of what white privilege is. They first have to understand their privilege, and then they have to take action on that privilege to dismantle that privilege. And so it's a very insulated thing, and there's a lot of layers that we have to break through in order to just get people to realize that racism is a problem. And, I think in general, people have a hard time with 2 things: accountability and guilt. Right. And the way in which we are talking about racism today is not this indirect, nebulous, vague thing that just kind of happens to people. We are calling racism what it is, and we are naming the culprit, and the culprit is white supremacy. And so it requires people who benefit from racism, white people, to hold themselves to account. Right. I mean, it requires white people to say, maybe I have benefited from white supremacy, or maybe I have been complicit in harming people of color, even if unintentionally, or hey, maybe I do hold racist views, or I've said racist things, or I have allowed racist behaviors in my presence. And then simultaneously, once people start having these conversations, they start to feel guilty about racism. And so they try to avoid it rather than just sitting in that guilt and then moving into action. Guilt is a natural response to learning more about the realities of racism, but it isn't particularly helpful. I mean, we aren't interested in white people feeling guilty about racism, right? Because feeling bad about it doesn't do anything to solve the problem. But it is a natural response, and people don't like to feel that guilt, whether they've been actively oppressing people or they've just been complicit in the realities of racism. And so they deny that racism is real so that they don't have to carry any responsibility for it, and they don't have to feel guilty about it. And so it requires us breaking through those different levels of privilege, of guilt, and getting to the core issue of how racism is actually at play in our society and how we can break those barriers down.
You've opened up a can of worms, Jane, when you said that we shouldn't use the word black, we shouldn't use the word white, that there is no color. There were comments that were coming into our social media pages saying, how can you not see color?
A couple of black women who said they were black called me and said, we're tired of this. Now when we fill in a form where it says race, we put human. And where it says color, one said, I put mocha. The other said, I put chocolate. Makes perfectly good sense to me for people to say that we're all different shades of brown. Let's find a color name in the thesaurus. Go to the thesaurus, look for synonyms for brown, find the color of your skin, and use that for your color from now on. This black and white nonsense has to stop. It was a lie to start with, and it needs to stop. And let's talk about white privilege. Have you read that white privileges list that Peggy McIntosh wrote in 1987? Practically every sentence in that says I can do this and this and this and not be corrected because of my race, because of my race, because of my race. Well, evidently in 1987, she didn't realize that there's only one race. But if she had those privileges because of her race, then we all have those privileges because we're all members of the same race. We will not solve this problem until we recognize the truth, which is we are all members of the same race. And this is the problem, people. If you have people who are educated to believe this, and they're now running schools and running governments and running countries, they will continue to believe what they were taught, grades K through 12. It's time to re-educate the police department, the legislators, certainly the members of the Senate, certainly the members of the House of Representatives, to the truth of life instead of living the lie. White folks think that racism is good for them. It is damaging them every day because it gives them a false sense of their superiority and their self-image. It's time to tell the truth. I want to see the day, and I'll live long enough to see it. So if you want me to die, get up here in a hurry. I want to see the day when people recognize that they're all members of the same race and we all have the same rights and privileges in this country. And I want us to start in teaching, instead of teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, I want to teach the 3 R's of rights, respect, and responsibility. And when you're talking about accountability, you're talking about responsibility. And I'm not talking about guilt among white people here. I'm talking about white people's responsibility for having started this, and now it's our responsibility to put a stop to it. If we are as powerful and as smart as we think we are, and as we say we are, we can stop this thing, and we can stop it in 2 generations. I did with my classrooms when I was teaching 3rd grade and then junior high in Riceville, Iowa. And if one class can make a difference in a community, and those classes did, they changed that community in positive ways because those kids who came out of those classes would not tolerate racist remarks being made in their presence, not even by their fathers. We could change this if we did a better job of educating.
I'm sorry. I have to chime in. I love you, Miss Jane Elliott. I'm older than I look, and I've been watching you since the days of Oprah and Phil Donahue. But we must.
I'm older than I look too.
We must keep data on. You can call it race. You can call it ethnicity. One of the ways that we found out that COVID-19 was disproportionately impacting African American communities, 2.5 times as many African Americans, 3 times as many Hispanics, is because we kept that data on race statistics. In 2018, Milwaukee County decided that racism was a public health crisis, and they began to keep very detailed data on racial disparities and morbidity and mortality. And it was actually those studies, when COVID-19 first struck, that alerted people to these racial disparities in the way that COVID-19 was affecting communities. Then Louisiana listed studies. At the time, many states, including Georgia, were not keeping morbidity and mortality statistics based upon race. And if we just don't do it, then we cover up all of these disparities. We've got to track the data until we repair the problem. Once we've made reparations and we have fixed all of these things, then we can stop tracking the data. But we cannot know that these disparities exist if we are not tracking data.
We want to go to viewer comments because we had a viewer say that I am not a racist, but I don't understand if Black Lives Matter, why are so many blacks killing each other? No one ever answers or brings up that subject. Basically what this person is saying is black on black crime. So who wants to weigh in on that, because that's a heavy topic?
Well, you're a city there you are. Go ahead.
I will very quickly. This is something we talk about in Black Lives Matter all the time. Before I was a councilman, I was a Black Lives Matter organizer. I'm still a Black Lives Matter organizer. All crime is intraracial. So and what I mean by that is that because we still live in segregated cities, most people commit crimes against members of their own race. So most black crime is committed by black people against black folks, and most white crime is committed by white people against white folks. The black on black crime is an invention of the media, which over-reports crime that happens in African American neighborhoods. But again, these statistics show that crime amongst races is pretty much equal amongst all races.
Let's move on to police. We found some very interesting facts there.
That's right. Police departments were formed to chase black people, okay? So they were called slave patrols back then. The National Law Enforcement Museum says Southern policing in America began with 3 goals in mind. 1, to chase down, apprehend, and return runaway slaves. This is fact. 2, provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And lastly, maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who violated plantation rules. Now, listen to this. The 1828 Slave Patrol Oath read in part, "I do swear that I will, as searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves, faithfully and as privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs to the best of my power, so help me God." Okay, so with that in mind, why should blacks trust police? And we already know, and we always talk about that there are more good police than there are bad police. But we're talking about a thin blue line where policemen protect each other. Good cops protecting bad cops. So again, why should black police be trusted? Or why should black people trust police? That's the question to any of our panelists.
You know, I might say one thing. I really do believe that something that needs to change, so obviously, is some training. When that policeman had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, if one of those other cops, one of them, had knocked him off that guy, it would have saved that man's life and all of their careers. If someone just, one of those guys did the right thing, and they didn't do it. And they have got to police themselves until we can rework this whole system. They need to police themselves on that thing, and that is not anything that they are used to doing. And I appreciate that folks putting their life on the line for me every day, but there has got to be a revolution in training there.
Black people have every reason to mistrust the policeman because of the code of silence that they do have and that they utilize every day. And yes, either one of those other men could have stopped the murder of George Floyd, but they don't want to interfere with their fellow officer. They don't want to be branded as a person who's soft, rather than a person who is right and who really upholds his laws to protect and serve. They would rather be liked. They would rather go along with this code of silence. And that has caused the death of thousands of Black people in our history.
And now, Elaine, I want to keep you here because you've seen some of that mistreatment up close and personal. And one thing I did not mention in introducing you earlier is that your family is known as the most arrested family during civil rights because of your action, the action that you effected through protest. How did it feel during that time to not feel as if you had protection from the people who were supposed to be protecting and serving you during that time?
Somewhere and somehow it needed to be changed. And we were willing to be the ones to put ourselves out there on the front line to see that these changes took place. So it's, and we have to do the same thing now. When I see these young people out here marching, it's the same struggle, it's the same problems. And so they are putting themselves on the line, and they are being brutalized, they are being tear gassed, and shot with rubber bullets and horrible things of that nature. It's the same fight, it's the same struggle, but we cannot relent in our struggle because it will not change. We do have to put words into action. It's good to have these conversations, but we have to put it into action. We have to change the systemic racism that is in our police system, that is in our government from top to bottom. And until we do that, then we're going to have to keep fighting these same battles. But we need all people of goodwill and people who understand what racism truly is, and it needs to be rooted out from its core. It's going to take everybody
It is going to
human
take
race,
everyone. Thank you so
to
much,
do
Ms.
this.
Elaine. We have a comment from our viewer. This one comes from Karen that reads, "We don't condone rioting and burning, but when we burn down buildings, for instance, a liquor store, we're burning it down because it creates alcoholics. It destroys our community. The Target in Minneapolis was burned down because they don't pay us a livable wage anyway, so why have it there?" Panelists, what do you say when people say that? Let's get between the difference between rioting
and rioting
and peaceful protesting. Right. Panelists, weigh in.
I'd like to jump in. That's actually a topic that's kind of touchy for me. I think we have to remember that we are talking about human beings' lives and not just buildings and businesses and money. Of course, no one wants to condone quote unquote rioting, but rioting is a language of the unheard, of the severely oppressed. You know, I, as a millennial, and growing up in Milwaukee, as we talked about briefly on the panel, I am from a very segregated, town, if not the number one most segregated city in the United States. And so we are used to being separated and oppressed, and we try to speak eloquently. We try to talk on panels. We try to show data. We try to inform you in the moment how things are being perceived. This is racist. This is prejudice. And we have been unheard. So we take a knee, like Colin Kaepernick, and try to say, police brutality is wrong. Well, you tell us to get up, that you guys are disrespecting the flag, you're disrespecting the country. So what else are we left to do? We've tried talking. We've tried to educate. We've tried all of the different ways that we know how to civilly, protest, and it goes unheard and it goes unnoticed for so long that the only thing that seems to get attention is maybe if we burn it down, maybe if we just tear these structures down that you have put to oppress us, maybe then you'll understand how we feel, and how what we've been trying to say so that their change can finally come. Now, of course, I am not telling everybody to go burn down their cities, but take that perspective for a second. Like I said, we've tried every other civil way to speak about our pain, and it's now we have to demonstrate it, which is also painful for us as well, and it's painful for everybody else around us. But how else are we supposed to get others to understand what we're going through and what we've been going through for over hundreds of years?
Well said. Beautifully said. And I think we also, I was in a previous life, I was a history teacher, American history teacher in high school. And I think let's not forget the Boston Tea Party. When those colonists threw what is understood to be about $1 million worth of tea into the harbor, and of course they, in their cowardice, they to confuse the British, they dressed as Native Americans. Many of them did, to try to pin it on someone else. Well, we need to remember that. I mean, that protest is lifted up. We put that stuff on a stamp, so that we can say what a wonderful thing it was. We need to remember that this country has been built on protests. Our suffragettes in 1920, 1919, fighting for the vote for women. Of course, in the 50s and 60s, civil rights movement. This is part of the fabric of what we do. I don't like people tearing stuff up either. Certainly don't like people hurting other people. But this happens.
Okay, we are just about out of time, but listen, this is what we know, that discussing racism is always difficult for many people because you know what, they're faced with an ugly truth, right? And sometimes, let's just be blunt about it, truth hurts. But we don't want to leave you watching online or on Facebook, feeling hopeless, because racism is a heavy topic. We want to leave you with an action plan to improve yourself and your community. So I want to hear from every single panelist now on how do we move forward.
Yeah, what should people be doing right now to end racism? Panelists?
Well, I would say that I think white people should really be focusing on being anti-racist, and that's in every aspect of their lives. You know, at home, teaching your children to be accepting of others, making sure that you have a diverse group of people around you, speaking out against racist comments or jokes said at the dinner table, educating your friends and family about how their behaviors could be racist and harmful to people who don't look like you. In the workplace, making sure your coworkers of color are being listened to and heard in meetings, helping your coworkers of color fight for a fair salary, making sure your job is a safe place for people of color. In your church, is your congregation diverse? Is your pastor or reverend teaching tolerance and acceptance, or are they teaching something else? You know, looking at all of the different systems and spaces in which you operate and ensuring that they are actively equitable and actively anti-racist.
Thank you, Nikki. Dr. Brown.
I'd like to echo what she said. It's really, to me, if you see something, say something. There's been multiple times, I'm sure, that you may have witnessed an interaction or someone of color has come to you and said that they've had an interaction. Speak up about it. A lot of things happen because no one checks it. And from a medical standpoint, we didn't really get a chance to touch on it too much, but of course, people of color, Black, Hispanic, and Native American all are disproportionately affected from medical problems as well. But also, we get the short of the end of the stick in the medical community. So if you feel as though you're not being heard, speak up. Say something to your doctor. Say, hey, doc, you know, I'm not really understanding what's going on. Can you please explain to me? And not as a challenge, of course. We've gone to school for a long period of time, but I don't know if there's not a physician that will be willing to explain to you the reasons why things are going on, why you are getting certain treatments, why you're not getting certain treatments, maybe having a discussion with you about options. So opening up conversations and having educated discussions about what's going on will help dispel things, especially medical bias in the community, and being educated about your own health and personal wellness goes miles in making sure that you get a fair shake in the healthcare system.
And Pastor Eli, thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Pastor Eli?
Well, I'm a Jesus guy. People used to say I look like him. I look more like Moses. I look more like Moses now. But and Jesus was a person of love. And I was listening to Pastor Michael Curry, who was the pastor who did the homily for Prince Harry and Meghan's wedding. You may recall him. And he says, love is not a sentiment, it's a commitment. It's not a sentiment, it's a commitment. And so it takes some action, and we need to learn to love people that we don't live in relationship with all the time. We need to love people that we disagree with. This whole Ruth Bader Ginsburg deal has been hard for me. I had such great respect for her. And one of the things I really respected about her is how she and Justice Scalia figured out how to appreciate one another and come from different places. We got a long ways to go. I really pray for us as a nation and pray for us as people, but we got to learn to embrace each other.
Love is a sentiment.
Yes.
It's a commitment. It's not a sentiment. It's a commitment. That's a lot more. Thank you so much, Pastor Eli. Up next is Elaine. Would you like to leave us with some final action?
Yes, as far as Black people, we need to persist and insist on our rights. We have to continue with our protest and demands for to be treated as human beings. And that has to be done on a constant basis because we need to leave this world better for our children. So it's up to us to do that. As far as white people need to have these conversations on a regular basis. They need to really understand their feelings and their actions and how it harms other people with white privilege. And they first need to admit that they do have white privilege and be willing to give up some of that privilege. And when the subject of reparations comes, be open to it, because the damage does need to be repaired. And that's what the reparations is all about. And that's what Black people are going to continue fighting for and demanding until that happens.
That's right.
I admire Pastor Eli and the fact that his congregation is working toward reconciliation and educating themselves and learning the history. That's all a part of it. And then put that into action. I wish more congregations would do that very thing. And that's what it's going to take in order for this to make any changes.
That's right. There's plenty of privilege to go around. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Elaine. We've got 2 more panelists to go before we wrap up in just a small amount of time. Councilman Khalid, would you leave us with some action items, please?
Yes, I think one of the most important things we can do, a lot of attention is being paid right now to the national elections. But a lot of the issues that we're talking about, whether it's housing discrimination, whether it's police brutality, a lot of these things are actually policies that are made at the city and the county level. It's not the President of the United States that decides what the use of force policy is for your local police department. It's your city council people.
We're going to end how we began. We began with Jane Elliott. We're going to end with Jane Elliott. Jane, give us some action moving forward and some plans on what we can do to end racism.
I think Frederick Douglass said it best. He said, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. If you don't resist, you will go down not fighting. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. We are going to have to insist that this situation change, and we're going to have to insist that we tell the truth in the schools in this country and that we educate instead of indoctrinating children of all ages.
Panelists, thank you so much. A big thank you to all of you. Miss Elliott, I couldn't believe that you answered my call and my email. I am so appreciative that you did, and to all of our panelists, I want to say thank you. Eli Morris, Nikki Bracey, Dr. Kimberly Brown, Elaine Turner, Khalid Camus, and of course, again, the Jane Elliott. We are extremely grateful for your time and frank conversation, and we thank you at home and online for joining us for our very first in a series of uncomfortable conversations, a candid talk about race and racism.
That's right. Remember to continue that talk, continue to listen, learn, and act to make change in your community. And share this town hall with your friends and your family. It's available on our website, localmemphis.com, and on our Facebook page, Local Memphis.
We believe deep in our hearts that something that was said was important.
We began the conversation.
Now, we leave you with Soulsville Charter School's Desmond Thompson with his remake of Sam Cooke's song, Change is Gonna Come. Have a great evening, everyone.
Born into a cold world, and I've seen the killings of young black boys and girls. Then we go to our leaders, and we ask, what do you see? And he'll say, America being great, and knocks me down on my knees. Oh, oh, we have too much heartache to give up now. We'll keep on marching, yeah, until we get our crown. It's been a long time coming, but I know that a change gonna come.